overrun by the military of Babylon, and they captured a lot of the younger people, what we might say the cream of the crop. They wanted the unblemished youth. And so as they took those and they began to teach them, and we saw in chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and no one could interpret the dream, and as a matter of fact, he forgot the dream. And he was about to execute all the wise men in the entire country, which would include Daniel, as he was elevated to that position. So he prayed about it, and God showed him the dream and gave him the interpretation. And so this morning we're going to pick up in chapter 3, and it's a familiar story, the story of the fiery furnace. But we're going to look at it from a different angle this morning because there were things going on besides that furnace, and I want to show you some of it this morning. So in Daniel 3, verse 1, I've got a map we can put up here. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king had made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So, my map up there, Bill. There you go. Over here underneath the first little red dot, that's the plain of Dura. And if you look all the way over to the left, you can see how far Israel is, and that's how far they were taken as captives all the way over to Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. And so this plain was a pretty flat area. We would call it a valley. It was a pretty flat area, so that when he set this statue up, it was visible for a long ways off. Its actual measurements, if you take the cubits and convert it, it was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And it was made of gold. And as I was reading some things about that statue, it's not really possible that it was solid gold, because it would have taken nearly 1 million pounds of gold to make it the size it was, if it was solid. And I don't think even Nebuchadnezzar had access to that much gold. So it had to have been an overlay, where they built the statue and then they overlaid it with gold. And then here's what the kind of an artist rendering of the statue and how it looked at that time. It might be a little more than 90 feet, but it was overseeing the valley there. So in verse 2, it says, And Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes and governors and captains and judges and treasurers and counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces came to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now if you notice here, there's no common people. It's all the ruling class that are coming to but this is the dedication. And so in this group, though, because of the promotion of the Hebrew Daniel and then Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego, they were all promoted into the ruling class, and so they would have been present for this, although I believe Daniel wasn't for some reason. In verse 4 it says, Then a herald cried out aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of and I'm not going to list all these instruments, but there's a dozen of them, that you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whosoever fall not down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. How many of you have ever wondered, why is there a furnace? I mean, it's pretty much a desert. Couldn't be using it for heat. Why do we need a furnace out in the middle of a plain? You're in a valley and you build this big statue and there's a furnace. The furnace was there because of the statue. It was used to melt the gold. They could melt the gold down and then they used it to, however they did it. But that's what it was there for, was to be used to melt the gold. So at this dedication, you have all the main people, but they're told that they have to bow down and worship. Now, if you know how Daniel has stood his ground and how the other three have stood their ground, you're going to realize this is going to cause a problem. I mean, they wouldn't eat the king's food because it was offered as a sacrifice to their gods first, so they said, I'm not eating that. And then Daniel goes to God and gets the interpretation of a dream that was nearly impossible for anybody to do, but God did it. And he stood against everything. He told the king, I can get this, but it's not me. I have to go to my God to get it. And so he's told that everybody's told that when these instruments start playing, that's kind of a strange thing. Now, he said if the trumpet sounds, that'd be one thing because you can pick out the trumpet. But he just says when the music starts. So let's hope you're not playing music, throughout the day because people are going to be up and down and up and down. But he says when the music starts, that you fall down and worship the golden image. It doesn't say here that it's an image of Nebuchadnezzar. Did you notice that? It says just worship the golden image. But I got to believe that after the dream that he just had, in which Daniel interpreted for him, and he saw all the statue that was in the dream, and the head was gold, which was him, and then all the other parts of it, that probably stuck with him. And so when he made this one, I think it had something to do with that. I can't give you a scripture that tells you that, but I kind of believe that that's where it's coming from. His mind had seen that image when Daniel gave it back to him. Also reminded me, it sounded familiar when I was reading this, and in Revelation chapter 13, verse 14, it says, speaking of the Antichrist here, it says, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image of the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live, and have had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. It's just like Satan to copy something else. You see, Satan doesn't do anything original. He doesn't do anything on his own. I don't think he's ever had an original thought. But he sees what Nebuchadnezzar did here, and in the Revelation he says, you know what, when I'm in charge, I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to put my image up, big statue, and I'm going to have everybody worship me, and if they don't do that, we'll have them killed. So chapter 14 and verse 10 and 11 say that those that worship the image are tormented with fire and brimstone forever. If you give in to what Satan's doing, in Revelation it says those that gave in were tormented forever with fire and brimstone. And if you look at this, if you don't give in, you're thrown into the fiery furnace. And so things don't stray too much. The Bible is so easy to follow if you just pay attention to what it has and what it's speaking to you. So there were some Chaldeans that were upset because Nebuchadnezzar had elevated these Jewish people, these Jewish men, into elevated positions. They saw an opportunity here to go after the three, Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego. Because if you think about this, you're standing out in this plain, and the music starts, everybody bows down, but there's three that didn't. They seemed about as tall as that statue at that moment. You think about everybody else is laying flat on the ground, and there's three guys standing there. It wasn't very hard to pick out the three. And so they went to Nebuchadnezzar, and they told him that these guys didn't bow, and they're not going to because they worship only their God. They don't worship your gods. And this kind of infuriated Nebuchadnezzar, so he sent for them and had them come before him. And in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar gives them a chance by asking them if it was true. I think he knows it's true because he already knew how Daniel was. He wouldn't bow to anything. And so he comes to him and he asks if it's true. And I think he wanted to give them the opportunity to recant. I don't think he really wanted to do the things he was about to do. So he gave them the opportunity, but they didn't take it. So they refused. And it's interesting the way they put it when they said they refused. They said that we not only did we not, but we're not going to. no matter what you do, we are not going to bow to this statue. So in Daniel 3, verse 15, it says, "Now, if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the instruments, you fall down and worship the image which I have made, well." In other words, that's good. "But if you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace." Now look what he says here. "And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Now, don't you think that's the gauntlet? He just threw the gauntlet down for God. He just challenged him. That's not a good thing to do, friends. It's not good to challenge God in things. He's looking at it and says, so who's this God that's going to take you out of my hands? I got to look at Nebuchadnezzar. He just met the God that can do this when it came to the dream. Nobody else could do it. Daniel took no credit. He said, only God can do these things, and he gave it to me. This was not me that did this. And so he's already met a God that's pretty powerful. And to stand out there and challenge him like this, I just think that if you've risen to the place of king, you should be smarter than that. But it's kind of like our leaders today. You don't have to be smart to be a leader. Yes, I said it. Daniel 2, verse 47, it says, "The king answered and said unto Daniel," this is what he said to Daniel when he interpreted the dream for him, "Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret." He's looking at him, and he knows how powerful he is, but he's challenging him right here. And it's going to be interesting to see what he does. Since the three refused to worship the golden idol, verse 19 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar's intentions, but there's also a clue to something else here. Daniel 3, verse 19, it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar, full of fury, and the form," look at this, "the form of his visage," which means his face, "was changed against Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. Therefore he spoke and commanded that they should heat up the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated." Two things here I want you to see. One, this is the same wording they're using when they talked about Jesus when he was headed for the cross and he was beaten. And it says his visage didn't resemble a man. In other words, he was beaten so badly that his face didn't even look like a man's face. So they're saying here that Nebuchadnezzar got so infuriated that his face changed. And I believe what we're seeing here is that we're seeing a demonic influence. And I think that demonic influence is contorting him because it really doesn't care if it's comfortable, not comfortable, whatever's going on, it doesn't care. But I believe it's contorting him because somebody's standing up against what they're trying to do. They're trying to control a nation. An entire nation has been told, when you hear that music, you bow to that statue. It's an idol. And it's not God. And anything that is not God is bad. And so with this thing being an idol, and they're trying to turn a whole nation, and all of a sudden you got 3 boys standing up and saying, I won't do it. Well, their mind is they got to put an end to this right now before it spreads. They can't let this spread, so they've got to put an end to it. And so they've got, Nebuchadnezzar is looking at him, and he's saying, if you don't do what I'm telling you to do, you're going in the furnace. Now, I don't think the furnace was really an execution set up for that purpose, but hey, it's right there. All we got to do is build a fire. The second thing I want you to see in verse 19, though, and this tells me some important things. It says, he commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it should be, more than it's used to be heated. 7 times more. Why 7? Why didn't he just say twice as hot? I mean, it's a fire. It's going to take care of a person no matter how hot it is. You can't throw people in a fire and they come back out and say it wasn't hot enough. So no matter how hot it was enough. But he says 7 times more. The amazing thing here is the number 7. The number 7 is used in scriptures almost 500 times. God uses the number 7. In the Bible, the 7 represents, look at this, completion, perfection, and I love this one, divine intervention. When he said to heat that oven to 7 times, it told God, it's time to intervene. Divine intervention. God's going to move into this situation. If I was Shadrack, Meshack, and Abednego, I would look at that and say, awesome, 7 times. That means here comes God. That's his number. He used that on some pretty important things. Examples of the number 7 in Scripture were the Israelites marched around the fortified walls of Jericho 7 times before the walls came tumbling down. They represented the fulfillment of God's promise. The book of Revelation speaks of 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, all symbolizing the complete fulfillment of God's plan for end time. On the 7th day, God ended his work and he rested. He said, all is done. 7 is an important number. Jesus made 7 statements while he was on the cross. His final being, it is finished, meaning completeness. So when he ordered this furnace to be heated 7 times hotter, I knew that this was a supernatural standoff. He's challenged God. Now he's thinking he's going to do something that nobody could recover from. Nobody can do this. He even said, who's this God who's going to come and take you out of my hands? How many of you have ever been in a situation in life where you thought, nobody can help me with this? It just becomes overwhelming. You get overloaded with things, and suddenly you think that, first of all, nobody knows what I'm going through. Nobody understands. And it's so overwhelming that nobody can help me. There's just no way. But you know, if you look at this, God's saying it doesn't make any difference how much the world can throw at you. I can handle it. I can take it. The thing is, you have to give it to him. These 3 Hebrew boys are standing there, and they're challenging the leader of the largest nation on the planet of the time. And they're looking at him and saying, I'm not going to do what you want. And so he not only says to you, you're about to be executed, but he says, I'm going to challenge that God of yours, and I'm going to prove once and for all, Nebuchadnezzar is above all. And my gods are better than your gods. Boy, if this was a movie, this would be the point everybody's scooting up in their chair like, here it comes. Here comes the good part. The fight's about to start. So as he orders this furnace to be heated 7 times hotter, the boys are looking at him and saying, we're not going to do it. No matter what you say, no matter what you do. If it turns out that he doesn't save us, then we just go home. But if he does save us, then you know who the real God is, who the true God is. I've got a picture of a furnace that was similar to what was used there. Everybody thinks of some big thing, but it was just used to melt the gold. And so, if you think about this, it says that when they put them in the furnace, it was so hot that the men throwing them in were killed. I mean, they didn't get in the fire, but what I believe is that fire was leaping out of that thing. I mean, 7 times hotter. It wasn't designed for that. So, I mean, it's a blazing thing, and they got close enough to throw them in, and it killed the guys throwing them in. In verse 20, it says, and he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. One thing you have to understand is he said he commanded the most mighty men. He took the best he had and put them up against God, and it didn't work. Now, when he goes to battle, his mightiest are gone. He doesn't have them anymore. But it was also a point of, I think, as Nebuchadnezzar was in his mind, was just a little not sure. So I want my best. I'm not going to send a couple scrawny kids up there to toss these guys in. I mean, they're bound. You could have just put them up there and gave them a boot. But no, he had the best he had trying to go up against God and everything God was going to do. And I remember in Daniel 3:15, he said, who is the God that shall deliver you out of my hands? He's about to find out. because by heating that oven 7 times, Nebuchadnezzar commanded that there will be divine intervention. I don't think he knew what he was doing. And you got to realize that being manipulated by the demonic realm, that realm is not among the brightest. They make a lot of mistakes and they do a lot of silly things. And they think way too much of themselves. And so everybody here has got set up for a finish that no one's going to forget. So the furnace workers, they took the 3 Jews and threw them into the furnace. But the furnace being 7 times hotter and the flames leaping out, and it killed the guys throwing them in. But they managed to get them in there. Now God shows up personally. Isn't that awesome? You know what I was thinking to myself? It would have been awesome if they threw them in and the fire went out. I mean, he could have done that. He threw them in and a massive rainstorm came up and just put everything out. There were a lot of ways God could have showed his hand. There were a lot of ways that he could have came in and said, I'm more powerful than anything in this world. I can do this. He could have had the furnace just disappear. There's all kinds of things he could have done. But how many in your mind would think he would join them in the fire? See, if you were laying this story out, most people look at it and there's all kinds of ways it could go, but did we think in our heart that he was going to join them in the fire? That just seems like, whoa, what's the purpose? Unless the fire is not going to hurt anybody. A fire that was 7 times hotter than it takes to melt gold. And these guys are in that fire, and they're not being burnt. Verse 24, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spoke, and said unto the counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And you got to look at this last part. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. I want to ask you something. He didn't even know God had a son. Isn't that amazing? He's witnessing Jesus pre-incarnate, but Jesus is here, and he's in that fire with them. He didn't save them from the fire. He joined them in it. I will never leave you nor forsake you. No matter what you're going through in this life, God never said, I'll keep you from it, except one time. And I'll share that with you in a minute. But what he does is he gets you through it. So no matter what the situation you're going through in this life, he's going to join you. He says he lives in us. And so no matter what you go through, as soon as they throw you in that fire, he's in there with you. And he's capable of overcoming anything this world throws at you. The world cannot overcome God. And if God lives in you, then the world cannot overcome you unless you give in to it. If they had gone in and fought and had their leaving drag marks into the fire because they just weren't going to have this done, and they're in there screaming their heads off, they're giving up. And God can't work. But they stood in faith. They told Nebuchadnezzar, it makes no difference what you do. We are not going to worship that idol. If this was Romans, they would have tied their hands and feet to 4 different horses and pulled them apart. One of the cruelest things the Romans had ever devised for torture. But they would have even stood to that and said, because they said, no matter what you do, we will not worship that idol. How many of us can stand our ground in such a way that we look at the world and we say, no matter what you do, I will not give in? You know, we have within us everything it takes to stand our ground. But sometimes we worry about what other people think. Sometimes in our mind, we begin to get doubt, that unbelief cast in there because of the world. We see things and and all the things that are going on, our eyes get filled with those things, and doubt starts to creep in, and if you let doubt get a hold, it's a faith killer. You can't let doubt get in there. The Word is the Word. God's Word is true. Under all conditions, it is true. And if He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you, then our mind should understand that as soon as I go in the fire, Jesus goes with me. He's in there with me. We don't have to hope He shows up because He's in us before we even go into the fire. He's in us. We've got to get this, friends, because we're headed toward a time that the world is going to lose its mind. And if the Lord tarries, we're going to see some of it. We're not going to see it all, and that leads to the one time that God said, I'll keep you from it. Because most of the time we have to go through it, but He's with us and He brings us through. But in Revelation chapter 3, He talks to the church of Philadelphia, and He said, because you've not forgotten the name Jesus, I will keep you from the hour of tribulation that comes upon the whole world. It's the only time I know of that He kept it from happening. Otherwise, there are always things, there are trials and tribulations and things in this world that we go through, but He says you're never alone, ever. That's why it was so important for Jesus to make that statement, friends. We've got to carry that in our heart all the time, that He is with you. No matter what you go through, no matter what you face, He is with you. You don't have to call and say, help me, Jesus. He's already there. You don't have to say, I sure hope I make it through this. He's right there with you. He's going through it with you. No matter what it is, no matter what you're hearing, no matter what your soul, which is your emotions and your senses and your memories and all that, they're all being tortured in this world. But no matter what you're going through, the thing you have to grab hold of is that God is with me and He will help me. Because, friends, there's all kinds of fiery furnaces, and not all of them look like the one we saw here. Sometimes it's just the situation you're going through, but in your mind, it's just as bad as that. When somebody tells you you've got a sickness that can't be dealt with, when you have a heart attack and they tell you nothing we can do, there's too much damage, it's going to be fatal. You know, we get a sense of, what do I do now? What we've got to do is get a hold of the Word, and the Word says that God is the great healer, and God is bigger than this thing, and you don't have to go by what the world says. He's always with us. And when things don't go the way we want it to, He's there to pick up the pieces and to help us to recover. Friends, all of us are going to lose loved ones because the Bible says it's appointed to man to die but once. So all of us are going to die unless the rapture occurs. Okay, and in a sense, you still die because this body dies. When you leave it, it falls over dead. Well, that's all that happens when you die today. You leave it, the body falls over dead. We're all going to have that situation. But I'm going to tell you, as many times as I've done funerals, I can tell you that it is among the worst time of anyone's life to lose a loved one. Everything in you is thinking differently. You're looking to the future, and it looks totally different than it ever did before because now that loved one's not with you. And you're looking at the despair that tries to overcome you. Thoughts try to overcome you that nothing's ever going to be the same. I'm never going to smile again. I'll never know joy again. All these things come over you because Satan is trying his best to get a hold of you and to make you go in the direction he wants. He wants you to be in grief forever. But the truth of the matter is, He gave us enough information in the Scriptures so that we know where our loved ones are, that we can look at it and we can say, yes, I miss them. My heart is ripped apart. But God restores. He can put my heart back together, and I know where my loved ones are. And you know what? I told you the story before about my dad died on the side of the highway in the dark, and I always was angry about it, and I finally got up the nerve to go to God with it, and I said, it wasn't right. My dad served you. He did all kinds of things in ministry to help you at his own expense. He did everything on his own, and that's how you let him go. And then he showed me what really happened, and I had to back up and say, I'm sorry. That was the most awesome thing. What you showed me in that situation was the most awesome thing. If you belong to him, you never die alone, ever. We know where our loved ones are. If they knew Jesus, we know where they're at. And if I had the ability right now, if God gave me one thing, he said, I'll grant you one thing. Most people would say, bring my loved one back. I want him back. I wouldn't do it because I know what he's already seen. I know what he's already experienced, and I would not bring him back to this. My little dog, maybe, but not this. I wouldn't bring my dad back into this situation. He lived for the reward. And now he's got it. Why would I bring him back? Yes, I miss him. When I owned my own business, there were always times when he had wisdom that I didn't because of his age and the things that he did. He had more wisdom than I did. And so when I run into a problem in my business, I'd call him. He was my go-to guy. I got the conveyors down, Dad. I can't figure out what's going on. And so he'd say, have you checked the power to the conveyor? Have you blown a fuse? I mean, he started giving off this list, and it usually turned out to be one of the things he said. And that wisdom always got me through the situation. And then he was gone. The first time I had a problem, I felt absolutely lost because I thought, what am I going to do? I don't have anybody to call. It never dawned on me to pray until I was already so stressed over the situation, and I thought, God, you got to help me. Oh, wait a minute. God, you can do this, Lord. Just give me the wisdom. He says, those who ask for wisdom, it will be given. It's the Holy Spirit's job. And so I asked, and you know what? Things started coming to mind, and I started thinking of what my dad would have said, and all of a sudden I found the problem. But I didn't have to count on my dad anymore. I could count on God. It was funny that my first thought was to go to my dad. But when he wasn't available, I went to God. I want to convince you guys this morning, make your first thought God. He might send you to your dad, but make it God first. Because he's the one who knows all things. So Nebuchadnezzar looks in there and he sees these 4 people. And he says the 4th one is like the Son of God. Well, it's pretty interesting when they start bringing them out. Verse 25, he says, he answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the one is like the Son of God. And then verse 26, he says, Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke and said, Shadrack, Meshack, Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. And the 3 came forth out of the midst of the fire. Look what he says here. And the princes and governors and captains and king's counselors being gathered together saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair on their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. They didn't even smell like smoke. I'd be willing to bet people sitting around smelled like smoke, but they didn't. God didn't just come and make a little bit of a statement. He took charge of the whole thing. When he said fire has no hold over you, the Bible tells us the waters will not overtake you and the fires will not kindle upon you. When he said the fire had no hold over them, it didn't singe a hair. Do you know how much flame it takes for a hair? When I was a welder, I got a spark in my hair once. You want to see a fat guy move fast? All I heard was a fizzing sound. And I was beating myself stupid trying to put that fire out. But one little hair catches on fire and it joined, all the rest want to join in. Here you got a fire 7 times hotter than anything and it didn't even singe a hair. It made them absolutely immune to the effect of fire. What a powerful God we serve. The Bible tells us he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. If he did this yesterday, if he had the authority and the power to deliver them from that yesterday, then don't you think for a moment that whatever fire you're in, whatever situation you're going through, that he won't deliver you from it, because he will. It is who he is. He is love, and he operates in love. These boys stood up against the mightiest person on the earth of that day, the king of Babylon. They stood up to him and said, no matter what you do, we will not follow your direction. And in their hearts, they had to know there was going to be repercussions. But you know what? They said it doesn't matter. Because no matter what you do to us, either God intervenes or we're going home. Either way is good with me. Either way, whatever happens, happens. Do I want to go into a fire? No, I really don't. I've always said I'm not afraid of death. I'm just afraid of how it comes. Because I have this thing, I don't want to drown. I don't want to burn. Those would be hard ways to go. I do think, like seeing an arrow sticking out of my chest, I think that would just freak me out. So I don't think I want that either. I'm thinking like African sleeping disease. You go to sleep, never wake up again. Okay, awesome. But if I got to go and I know that he's with me, I'm not going to worry about what it is. Well, see, we're not going to have to go through the tribulation, but those that are in the tribulation, they're going to have to face death. And they're going to have to be able to face it with faith intact that says, no matter what you say you'll do to me, I'm not going to give in. Just like these boys did. You're going to have to look at whatever's taking place and say, I see it, and it is the scariest thing I've ever seen, but I will not give in. And I'm telling you that there will be so many who think they're faithful who will give in when they look at it. Because they don't have the one thing in their heart that you have to have. You have to have an image of Jesus and says, no matter what, he will never leave me and he'll never forsake me. And even if this body dies, he's right there. He's right there. When we go, Jesus is there for us. He says, I will come back and receive you unto myself, that where I am, you will be also. So no matter how you go, whether it's on the side of a highway or some dread disease, no matter what it is, whether it's instantaneous or it takes a while, it doesn't matter, because at that last moment, that last breath you draw, Jesus is there. And you know what? Because he is in spirit and he works with the Holy Spirit, he can be in all places he needs to be. Because he's with you right there in that hospital bed or on the side of that highway or whatever it may be, he's right there with you. And that's not going to change. So they came out of the fire and there was no evidence that they were ever in the fire. You know, when I was young, we had a house that burned down. It didn't burn all the way down, but one whole back side of it burnt. A fire truck was sitting about 2 blocks away, but they were having a job action. It was a union thing, so they didn't answer the call. And we had to wait for the town nearby to send theirs. And it probably took time for somebody to realize we're not answering this. But anyway, by the time they came, the whole side of the roof had caved in. But after they put it all out, we went in the next day and we tried in the other side to see if there was anything salvageable. Because we just ran out in the middle of the night with what we were wearing. And we went in there, and I'm telling you, even though we got into the drawers, and all the clothes were still folded, sitting right there in the drawer, but everything smelled like smoke. We washed it 12 times, and it still smelled like smoke. We could not get the smell out of it, and so basically everything was a loss. The furniture, everything. Pictures that were on the wall all had that smell. And when you smelled it, it brought the memory back. And you remember standing out in the front yard watching the house burn. And all of a sudden a fire truck shows up from a nearby town, and you're thinking, where's the guys for us? They're just down the road, the firehouse. They should have been here 20 minutes ago. I'm standing right by the fire hydrant, and the guy on the truck throws me the hose and says, hook that up. I'm like, hook it up? I don't know how you hook up a fire hose. So I'm fumbling with it and then here comes the guy and says, get out of the way, I got the tool. I'm like, well, I'm glad somebody's got it. I don't know why he told me to hook it up. I was a kid. But I'm thinking to myself, when you come out of this and you don't even smell like smoke, don't you think God was saying to Nebuchadnezzar that you have zero power? You have nothing. Not only did I save them, but there is no evidence that it ever happened. Not a singed hair, not even the smell of smoke. If there was, they'd go around town and people would be going, man, I remember that day they put you in the fire. Yeah, I can smell that smoke on you. But there was no evidence. When God delivers you from whatever it is you're going through, there won't be any evidence you went through it. Because you'll be restored. You'll one day, even though you've lost that loved one, one day you're going to look back and you're going to remember them and you're going to be laughing at things they did and you're going to be so happy and enjoying those times, right? When it first happens, you're thinking, I'll never smile again. I can't talk about them because it hurts too much. But I'm telling you that when it gets to that point where God has restored you, and then suddenly you can remember Grandma and you can remember Grandpa and things they did and laugh about it, the time they did something silly and everybody's laughing and that because you can do it now. Because God's restored you inside. But at first you're thinking to yourself. But what we've got to realize is God is going to get you through whatever the world throws at you. And if your loved one knew Jesus, then they didn't really die. They just moved on to the next life. And you're going to do the same thing one day. Verse 28, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. It looks like he got the message, except now he's calling Jesus an angel. See, I think when he was irate and the demonic realm was speaking through him, they knew who that guy was going to be. They knew it was going to be the Son of God. There is no way that Nebuchadnezzar could have known that God had a son. Because Jesus had not been Jesus yet. It was pre-incarnate. It wasn't known that he was the Son until Jesus came back and said, I am the Son. So there's no possible way on this earth that Nebuchadnezzar could have known, but that demonic realm knew. Because Jesus has always been. And they knew that when God sends someone to these major events on earth, he sent the pre-incarnate Jesus. We don't see it that way because he didn't have the name yet. His mother named him when he came here, but prior to that, he wasn't called Jesus. But I believe that demonic realm that was working here knew who that was in the fire with him. And that's why it came out of Nebuchadnezzar's mouth as saying that he looks like the Son of God. Because the demonic realm was just out of control at that point. It's like, man, we had this all worked out, and look at this. There he is again. I like it when it talks about, where did it say that? He delivered his servants and trusted in him and have changed the king's word. See, the king thought he had absolute authority. Whatever he says goes. Friends, there's going to be times in this world when people are going to look at you and they're going to say something to you and they're going to think they have absolute authority. That's why they tell you can't fight City Hall. Well, you can. But you can't do it alone. You got to have God with you. But people think they have absolute authority. And when they say something to you, it's law. You can't do a thing about it. But I'm telling you right now, God overrules law of man. There are times, especially if it's going against one of God's statutes, one of the things he's told you, if it goes against that, he will intervene. If they told you you had to have an abortion, you don't have a choice, you have to have one. That is against what we believe. It's against what God believes. And if you stood your ground, I promise you, you would have the full backing of God in whatever it is you're doing. Whatever that situation, you've got his backing, and he is not going to leave you alone. Not for a moment. But you have to stay strong. You cannot give in. If you give in even for a moment, then it gives Satan ground. So he admits they're not going to worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill. because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. So he challenged God, and God won, and now he's convinced there is no God like their God. Hey, good news, that's our God too. Isn't that awesome? So I'm no longer afraid of the fiery furnace, because I know that when it comes, God's going to step in right there with me. Friends, we can face whatever the world has. Whatever Satan thinks he's going to throw at you, you can take it. It's hard, especially when your soul gets involved, because your soul is your emotions and your thoughts and your senses and all that stuff, and it messes with you all the time. But at some point, you just got to overrule your thoughts. You got to say, no matter what I feel, what I know is that God loves me, and he said he'll never leave me and he'll never forsake me. I know that. I may not feel it, but I know it, because it says it in here, and we know this is true. Every word. And if it says he'll never leave me, then I know I'm not alone. And friends, we can defeat most things in this world by knowing we're not alone. Because what happens is Satan tries to isolate you, and he tries to make you feel like you're the only one that knows this. You're the only one that's ever felt it. No one knows what I'm going through. I've said that myself. I've been in the middle of things, and I thought to myself, people are trying to comfort me. I'm like, you don't know. Have you ever done this? Because if not, you have no idea what I'm going through. And that's true for other men, but not for God. God knows. You know, when Jesus came to I think it was Bethany, when Lazarus died, it said he was moved by their pain. The mourners, by their pain, he was moved. And it actually says he wept. Jesus had a soul. When he was on this earth, he had a soul, and he had emotions, and he had control of them. They didn't rule him, he ruled them, but he still had them. And he knew what it felt like to lose someone he cared deeply for. Lazarus was important to him. And when he lost him, it moved him to tears. But he also knew where Lazarus was going. But he felt what everyone else felt. And no matter what we go through, friends, God knows what you're going through. And it's part of the reason Jesus was here. He needed to experience what we go through personally, not just say as a God, oh, I know what they go through. But he needed to go through it as a man, so that he knew when you came to him saying, Lord, I can't do this. You don't understand. He could say, yes, I do. I've been there. I've felt that myself. I know exactly what you're feeling. And I can help you with it. You just have to let me. I'm going to go ahead and stop right here. We're going to continue unless God says.